Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today, we're going to be talking about cyber espionage, and our guests are Meg King, who is director of the Wilson Center's Science and Technology Innovation Program, and Melissa Griffith, who is a public policy fellow with that same program. Meg, Melissa, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So let me, if I can, begin with definitions, because I'm sure that people are thinking of things in the news now, these ransomware cases around the Colonial Pipeline and JBS as the recent examples, MTA in New York. But that's not what we're talking about here, right? What we're talking about is different than ransomware attacks. Could you define for us what cyber espionage is?
I think it's important to remind that there are different capabilities used by different actors in different settings. I'll start with a very basic definition, and Melissa can help clarify it. But both nation states and criminal actors have used ransomware. The Russians have used ransomware in a variety of attacks, and so have, as we've just mentioned, a number of criminal groups with different aims. And that's where I'll let Melissa take over.
Yeah, so I think it's important to level set because we can play a little fast and loose with some of these terms, but they do refer to different types of behavior. And I think Meg started to pull that apart, where you have on one side the cyber espionage label, and then on the other side, cyber attack. And those are not the same types of activity. So if we're looking at cyber espionage, these are the types of hacks using computer network systems that target what we call confidentiality of data. And that just means, did somebody see something they shouldn't have been able to see? Do they have access to something we would prefer them not to have, the confidentiality of the data? That sounds awfully like spying, traditional espionage, accessing information, getting that information back to your home country or home base. Espionage. Those are the types of attacks like SolarWinds. Ransomware, which is currently dominating the news and rightly so, falls under the cyber attack bucket. It's just one type of cyber attack. And these are kind of activity that compromises integrity or availability of systems and data. Integrity just means, was there data there that's now corrupted or you can't actually access it? It's been wiped, it's gone. And availability means maybe the data is just fine, but you now can't reach it, which is ransomware. They've encrypted it. So they haven't destroyed that data or altered it. They've just blocked you from accessing it. And those fall under attacks. And usually when we say attack, it's the kind of the 4 Ds: disrupt, deny, degrade, destroy. And then espionage is that much more traditional intelligence gathering, gaining information about a system, accessing and exporting that information. So ransomware is a separate beast from cyber espionage.
So while the attacks are getting the headlines, and as you said, rightly so, I mean, in some cases, we're not talking about minor disruptions, we're talking about major implications. Yet you might make the case that longer term cyber espionage is where the action is, because that could even have more profound implications. Meg, who are the players? And we know that there are a lot of non-state actors engaged in ransomware. Who are the players in cyber espionage? Is every country on the face of the planet engaged?
I wouldn't give every country credit, but the number is growing. It used to be kind of a big 4: Russia, China, the US, Israel. You could debate North Korea. It depends on kind of where they are, Iran. Now the list is somewhere in the range of 15 plus. So a number of nations, because they have access, especially during COVID, digitally, to either increase their tool sets and their skill sets, or access more digital operations online than they ever have before. There are quite a number of capable countries who can carry this out. And the tricky part becomes, and Melissa says this so well, is the point at which you identify an attack or a cyber espionage operation. It can change. So if we identify, and I can walk through the stages of an attack. If we identify at a certain point, we may have caught them early, as we may have in the Microsoft Exchange incident earlier this year, for which China was hopefully held responsible, or we could catch them later. And so you've got reconnaissance of your target. You've got development of the software that you need to use to carry out that attack. You've got to go authorize and get into the system. You've got to establish what's called command and control. You've got to then go in and do some intelligence. You've gotten in the network, but now you need to know where to go and what you can do. And then you can deliver a kind of malware, whether it's ransomware or similar. And then you kind of take it from there. So That's basically the way to think about it.
Melissa, without much hesitation, Meg was able to say about 15 countries engaged. You know, it raises the question, if this is all cloak and dagger stuff, how do we know what we know?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. One is I think we tend to think about this as some sort of black box in which we just can't potentially identify anything. But if you set aside cyberspace, countries like the United States, who are incredibly good at this, have other forms of intelligence gathering, right, in which they can help identify. So for example, if you're looking at the 2016 election and the hacking of the DNC, one of the primary sources for that information is a Dutch intelligence agency that is physically, they actually are inside the cameras in one of these facilities watching this happen. That's not kind of ones and zeros tracing forensics. They're watching something happen. Or there's a human intelligence asset on the ground that's saying, I've seen X or Y. So there's that components. The other thing is the kind of attribution process. How do you know who these actors are? And that sort of spans a variety of things. There's kind of like more technical indicators. And there you're really diving into the code and the tactics, techniques, procedures. Those things tend to match. They start to cluster into specific groups. They don't reinvent the wheel every time they operate. That can help you.
Are you talking about sort of like digital fingerprints?
It's digital fingerprints. It's exactly forensic. So it's sort of like every time you commit a crime, you tend to fall into similar patterns that help you identify, that was John this time. I think it was John again. And I think this was also John. And then that one was definitely different. It's probably Meg, right? That kind of being able to differentiate. And that's all at the technical level, really digging into the details. And you'll see this. They'll say, this particular piece of malware or this particular server has been used by this group multiple times. We think it's this group. Then you have the political components, which I think come up when you're looking at a lot of these high profile attacks against, let's say, just the United States. There's a handful of countries that have a geostrategic interest in carrying those out. So that happens, it kind of helps as well. You have a better sense of their background, what they're trying to do there, and then that counterintelligence piece. But yeah, so even though it's cloak and daggers, it's like most things, there's a variety of information that you're gathering there, and countries or individual crime groups tend to follow patterns.
Meg, for obvious reasons, when these types of things are reported in the US, it's usually from the perspective of the victim, right? We've been hacked. Are our fingers clean? Are our hands clean, or is everybody doing it?
Do you mean is the United States part of this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's when you're always hearing the news in the sense of we have vulnerabilities, something has happened to us. It sort of suggests that maybe we're on the receiving end and maybe not as active on the attack end or the espionage end. And I'm guessing that's not the case, but what is the case?
Well, the example I'll give, and it's something we teach in our cybersecurity lab for congressional staff, is that the US has lost some significant capabilities that we built ourselves. The name that of a software exploit is called Eternal Blue, lost by the NSA and believed to have been either accessed or used by Russia and others, for example. And so we actually show congressional staff how to use this software exploit because it's now, as they call it, out in the wild on the open internet. And so that's a huge problem that the US government is trying to address, this kind of software vulnerability disclosure process. All of the nations are trying to find these mistakes in software code that exist because we're human, and until we really automate, and even if we do automate, there may be mistakes, but until we get to a point where it's not humans writing the code, there will always be a mistake. And so it's a huge kind of cat and mouse game to try and identify those software exploits, which can actually be very expensive because it takes so much time to find them. And then there is a bit of a market for these. So.
If I may, John, I jump in
Melissa.
here actually, because I think this, I think Meg just teed me up for something that I would love to sort of flesh out, which is, I think often when this question gets asked, the assumption is if the US does it, it must therefore be okay, right? If we do it as well, everybody should do it. There should be no consequences. Just espionage, carry on. And I think that's a bit of a misnomer. So yes, the United States is very active in this space. Any capable country should be, right? That's sort of your strategic interest. But there's ways that you're active in this space that can be more or less responsible. So Meg gave the example of kind of the Microsoft Exchange incident. That looks really irresponsible from an international kind of security perspective, because there's a vulnerability, that patch is then coming out and you get a smash and grab effort. Get as much territory as possible, as many compromises as possible, get your feet in as many places, your fingers in. You have the kind of example of SolarWinds that's much more restrained in sort of what they're doing. They have access to far more devices, organizations originally with that update into those systems, that software update, and they choose to close a lot of those doors and really focus in on some other targets. So it's not smash and grab. It doesn't have the same sort of impact, shock and awe, concern around escalation and other groups picking up on those vulnerabilities. You have a kind of crime wave that comes in behind on the Microsoft Exchange. So there's that piece, your behavior matters. And I think the other piece that's really important here is just because spying happened does not mean it goes unpunished when it's discovered. And that's true outside of cyberspace as well. It wasn't like during the Cold War when you would discover significant compromises of your military industrial base, you would just go, oh, well, we're trying to do the same thing. There would be actions that were taken, whether those were expelling diplomats or exchanges of spies, right? There were a whole series of signaling and consequences for those as well. So I think, yes, we're doing it. We have very specific rules and regulations in which we can do it. Those different choices really matter. And also, just because everybody's doing it doesn't mean it's not an area that states should be upset when they discover it in their own networks.
And there is a price for getting caught. About that, what you just said, are we applying the same standards to the new espionage that we were to the old espionage in terms of response?
To some degree, I think, honestly, to some degree, I think we are. But I think we're actually missing a couple ways in which it's different, and we need to actually tailor our response in different ways. So often when we talk about the espionage space, everyone goes, this seems quite familiar. We've always done espionage. Kinetic espionage, now we're in the cyber espionage space, or we used to tap telegraphs and now we're doing sort of here, interception of telegraphs. I think there's a couple differences here that require different responses, though, that are worth fleshing out. One is the scale and scope of what you can actually access with a cyber operation that you couldn't historically. And I think you see these when they just see the numbers of devices or systems start to pop up when these attacks are happening or espionage operations hacks are happening. The sheer number of affected organizations is impressive. And the ability to maintain some command and control and access or persistence in those systems, unusual. The other piece is there are the durations of time that they've been in these systems. And often you'll hear about, oh, well, we think they've been in there about a couple months because that's when we picked them up, and then it starts pulling back and back all the way to several years before when they're laying the foundations for those operations. That's incredibly different. And then I think the other piece that means our response here has to be a little bit different goes back to a point Meg was making about the life cycle of a hack and what that looks like. Part of what makes cyber espionage different from traditional espionage is that that same foothold that you developed for, let's say, just gathering of intel can later be used for something else. That same persistence in those networks. So sometimes this is called kind of holding an adversary at risk, that you can change your mind at some point, you can pivot. Often it's the operation always meant to move to another stage. That's operational preparation of the environment. You just caught me in the espionage stages, but I always meant to do an attack. And sometimes it's just a crime of opportunity, right? Where you have access to a system, geopolitical tensions flare, and you're going to use that access in a way that makes sense in that environment. So those two things, scale and scope, and the ways in which persistence and networks can move between kind of what looks like espionage and what looks like an attack quite quickly, those sort of set it apart from traditional espionage.
Meg, in terms of threat assessment or measuring how concerned we should be about this, in the case of ransomware that we discussed earlier, I mean, we all saw in the DC area the long gas lines or the pumps that were out of gas. We might be able to go to a supermarket and see an increase in beef prices. That's immediate and it's recognizable to the average person. What are the threats associated with the type of espionage that we're talking about now?
Well, it's a significant amount of money as well. It's just money that the American public and other publics don't see. So I think that's a really important distinction. So while it's highly expensive, and I cannot underestimate how expensive these operations are, because you're talking in some cases years that groups work to find those vulnerabilities, to take the time to develop, and then once they enter a system, as Melissa's pointed out, to gain command and control, to really quietly assess what's on a network. Then they find something, they find data, they find ways to slowly, hopefully, in their case, take the data out for intelligence purposes and collection analysis later. So the cost is significant. It's just not something that people feel at the citizen level. If you look at the SolarWinds case and the Microsoft Exchange case, they both have significant ripple effects. And while Russia was more careful in carrying out the SolarWinds case and the access they had was limited, in China's case with the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability, it had the added challenge of not only did they have this smash and grab where they kind of took whatever they could, it left so many systems clearly vulnerable to then the cyber criminals who might carry out ransomware attacks. So there's this like double dimension of it's very expensive to do this, but it is the new way of carrying out espionage. If you want to make a decision about something, let's talk about the G7, any of those major kind of decision points for leaders around the world, you're going to want to know what they're thinking and try and find ways of assessing their communications and all of that. And so this way makes sense, but there are a lot of consequences.
Forgive the layperson.
Buzzword there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go right ahead.
John.
No,
I think
please.
there's a good buzzword there just to tap onto what Meg was saying, which is around China, which is one of the actors here that carries out a lot of cyber espionage operations. They have a very unique bend to those operations, and it's intellectual property transfer. And so one of the buzzwords you'll hear around that is China has carried out one of the greatest wealth transfers in the history of the United States, right? Really moving significant amounts of money that we don't see, but intellectual property, right? And the kind of value of those between one market to another.
When does cyber, what I was going to ask is from the perspective of a layperson, right? You're two respectable and prudent experts when you talk about this. And I have to admit that my imagination starts to run wild, and my questions start to feel more like there's something for a James Bond plot than for real life. But I just do need to ask you, because I assume other people might think this, when does cyber attacks or cyber espionage, as we're discussing it, become cyber warfare? When can malicious things happen, like shutting down power grids or stealing nuclear codes or things like that? Or is that just the stuff of fiction?
I'll take a stab and then Melissa will make sure that it's accurate. that most of the nations, we are at a point now where it's changing a bit, but most nations up until now have really been careful and walked right up to a certain line. Russia has pushed the envelope, but he mostly carried out kind of testing of new capabilities, if you will, in Ukraine and places where they really won't have consequences. You don't see Russia actively shutting down Colonial Pipeline themselves. It's criminals who are in Russia, and that needs to be handled, but it's not the Russian government. We're getting to a point, and it gets to your question of how many states are in this game, where we might actually see some inadvertent miscalculations. And that's where I think the risk might lie, is more that it's the nations that are potentially smaller, but have a lot to gain, and this kind of levels the playing field, if you will, between capabilities they may not have had in the past and kind of interacting with superpowers today. So Melissa, do you want to kind of take that next?
No, I think your point about miscalculations is spot on. And I think one of the ways that we need to be cautious to avoid that is with the terminology we use. So in terms of solar winds, there were a few very senior folks that immediately reached for this as an act of war type language. If you've ever been in uniform, you know what a war looks like, and that's not it, right? That's not kind of what that looks like. So often I think when we say cyber war, to me, it feels very redundant. If the United States is fighting a war, we're going to use all of our kind of methods at our disposal: air, land, sea, space, and of course cyber, which is one of the fifth domains. But we will be actively fighting a war, and it's not going to be hard to know we're going to be in that space. Below that threshold, you have this kind of more what I kind of refer to as cyber conflict space. And there's a lot of activity that's happening there, from influence operations to kind of actively the kind of infrastructure operations in 2015 and 2016 in Ukraine that targeted power grids in particular, to the United States, allegedly with Israel compromising kind of nuclear reactors in the nets and their nuclear program in Iran, to these sort of much more high-level spying gaining traction. All of those things sort of fall there. So I think it's useful for us to sort of bifurcate those. And I think it's also important to realize that those are geopolitical considerations. I think we sometimes look at cyberspace as if it's this amazing new frontier and things just happen there and states are like, oh my goodness, now we're at war. And that's not actually what these look like. These are deliberate decisions, and you can usually watch it as the code unfolds, where they went, what they're trying to target, where they're going next. These are very deliberate, and they're based on the political moment these countries find themselves in. So could we see an instance where cybersecurity or cyber attacks are integrated into warfighting? Yes, if we fight a war, it will be. We already do this, for example, in counter operations against ISIS, as we deploy these tools here. Will we continue to see a whole bunch of activity below that threshold? Absolutely. And the question is, can we lower that as the United States? Can we impose enough costs, take enough miscalculation out from that so that we don't get accidental escalation? Can we lower that threshold to a level we feel more comfortable with in terms of a kind of status quo?
So looking ahead, I'm going to ask both of you to put your heads together on this and talk about what we need to do to, what is the appropriate response level given the threat level and concerns moving forward. And if you could, as part of your answer, give us some sense of, where we sit on that scale. If 10 is as prepared as possible, given all that we know now and all the technology available to us, where do we sit on that spectrum? Are we really playing catch up, or are we in pretty good shape?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. So that's a really hard question to answer because there are so many variables involved. The US has a significant university system and academic researchers that are really on the cutting edge of a variety of technologies. So there's that advantage. We have a significant amount of money in which we funnel through to both that academic setting and then to business, both through the government and through the private sector. The challenge is we have a large country with a lot of private sector industry happening, and there's always the lowest common denominator you need to think about, your weakest link, which tends to either be humans or something that's a mistake a human has made somewhere along the line. And so everyone will always be battling that, but what we need to do is we need to design our systems with security in mind from the beginning, from now, because we're not doing that across the board. And the problem is we are also dealing in so many cases with older systems, and we need to move past that. I think that will help once more and more organizations move to cloud computing. That will help, but we're in a kind of, I'm not going to give us a number, but we're in a very good place, but everyone is always only as good as their weakest link.
Yeah, I would second that. I think it's a complex question. So it really does break down into different metrics. So you have the kind of much more systemic terrain question, which is like, how defendable is the ground we're trying to defend? And these are questions of how did you architect your systems? Are people putting best practices into place? Those kind of questions. And I think there, I wouldn't say we're behind, but we're also not ahead. It's a very challenging space. You have organizational dynamics here, which is, are we adequately organizing whole of country defense? And this is what Meg is pointing to about, are we actually leveraging our private sector in ways that are appropriate and in ways that kind of actually operationally mesh with our government? So not in paper, looks good, we collaborate, but in practice, do we do that in a reasonable way? And some countries are better at that. The United States is incredibly large. We don't historically use our private sector in that way for sort of national defense purposes. So it's kind of a new concept. There's a lot of growth and learning. And then you have these more dialectic relationships, which is, are we getting our bell rung vis-a-vis Russia? Are we getting our bell rung vis-a-vis China? And those are very different kind of metrics and concerns that you might have on each of those levels. So I think it's kind of important to pull it apart. Do you think the best response I've ever gotten to this question, which was, I was doing interviews in Finland and this quote came up out of a Finnish expert on cybersecurity who said, Finland may be a valedictorian, but we're a valedictorian in a class full of dummies. And I think that's sort of true. Everybody in this space is bad because it's incredibly complex, it's incredibly difficult. Anyone who claims to have this solved is lying to you, but you can be sort of top of the pack in sort of our struggles together. And I think the US is up there. We have some real concerns around these sort of public-private partnerships and some of these dyadic relationships and how we do those. But that doesn't mean we're sort of bottom of the tier.
That's a great quote for things beyond cyber espionage, right? A little humility goes a long way in battling complacency. Well, thank you, Megan, Melissa. You, for better or worse, are in a growth industry. We're glad that you're part of it because you're helping us understand it and navigate it. Before we close, Megan, along those lines, tell our viewers about what type of resources the Science and Technology Innovation Program has available to the public.
Yes, of course. We have an entire microsite dedicated to understanding 5th generation wireless networks, 5g.wilsoncenter.org, with a number of infographics you can go to understand around the world who is deploying what, where, and how, and also a fun infographic to help you learn how 5G will enable smart manufacturing, and then a number of pieces by Dr. Melissa Griffith. And then we also have a number of policy briefs to kind of lay out this challenge of cyber espionage and geopolitics on our website at wilsoncenter.org. Thanks
for all that terrific work, and thanks for today. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again for another soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.